Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next deep questions session with Saif. And today we get a rather interesting one that is probably quite relevant for every single one of us. And the question is as follows: how do I develop a rejection of sensuality gradually if I'm unable to go cold turkey on things like celibacy and non-entertainment? Yeah, I think that's very likely a question that most people will face nowadays, as the vast majority of people is very likely deeply swamped in sensuality. At least I would assume that our society nowadays is much more sensual than it has been at the time of the Buddha. You want to give it a first go, or should I do it?
Do you want to start? You have any thoughts on this?
Mhm. Well, I guess I can try. um, yeah, yeah. When it comes to any kind of renunciation, I would say that it's always a good idea to develop the entire approach in a gradual manner. If you go against that graduality and try to bite off more than you can chew, then all that will usually happen is that you will fall back and binge, which is something that you can observe in most quite mundane addictions too, I would say. When people try to get rid of, I don't know, playing video games all day or binge watching series or eating sweets or even heavier things like taking drugs, what they usually do is go through a weaning off process, at least when they are successful. So a person who tries to get off very heavy drugs, like heroin or cocaine or something like that, usually goes through a process of gradual weaning off through less harmful substances. And the same, as far as I'm concerned, kind of has to apply when it comes to weaning off sensuality. You first get off the worst kinds, um, like, yeah, the worst kinds of actions, the worst kinds of conduct, like as an example, taking drugs. Uh, all the things that I mentioned in the precepts, really, which are all quite gross. You stop those and try to stop them as best as you can, or try to implement the precepts as best as you can. It will very likely not be perfect because some of the precepts are quite difficult to implement, especially the one on speech or the other ones on intoxicants for some people. And the more you become comfortable with this new lifestyle and experience that this new way of being is actually superior and much less agitating compared to before, the more willing will the mind be to gradually renounce more and more. So you kind of need all the small rewards on the way. Otherwise, the mind will lose basically any interest in the process because the mind is used to a certain kind of safety, namely the safety of sensuality. And when you remove the mind from that domain of sensuality, it kind of, at least from the point of view of the mind, if that makes sense, you rob it of its source of safety. So it will not be pleased by not being allowed to roam in its usual domain. And it will rebel against that. And you will suffer from that. So it's much better if you approach the entire thing more gradually. Yeah. But how you do that, what gradual means, is sadly something that is quite individual, I would say. It's not something that you can just give a certain formula like renounce this much or whatever. That's sadly not how things work. So you kind of have to find that out for yourself, how much your mind is willing to let go of at any given time. And it, from my perspective, does involve quite a bit of trial and error. Any thoughts of, that you have on the topic?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like you said, it's because it's so individual, it's quite hard to answer. And I think the suttas can even be quite disheartening in this regard because when it gives the gradual training, it's of such a general quality that it's quite hard to figure out how to apply it on an individual level. If you think about it, like the gradual training, the very first two steps of establishing wholesome conduct and developing sense restraint. Like it's just the first two steps, but that already is basically forcing you to abandon literally all of sensuality and ill will, pretty much. Like the steps after that are just sort of a deepening of the mindfulness comes from that. But if you think about it, those are the first two steps. You're basically weaning yourself off the entirety of sensuality. The Buddha says sense restraint. He doesn't say like first give up like music and then give up this. He says in regards to the entirety of the senses, you give up the lust and aversion. Um, and that's just the first two steps. So it's quite disheartening. You're like, okay, right, but the first thing I'm doing is changing my life completely. Um, so you need to almost think about it in terms of like each particular step of the gradual training should have its own gradual training. So even the first five precepts, for example, especially if you're taking on, like Flaw said, the one about like idle talk, for example, it's quite probable that's going to take a long, long, long time to establish yourself in. Even if you establish yourself in it for a certain amount of time, like a week or two or something, it's quite often that you'll then, after that 2 weeks, you then fall back. And it's a cycle of up and down and up and down and up and down. Um, but yeah, like you say, like when the mind is used to such a level of safety, it's just impossible, even on a mundane level, to completely remove yourself from it. Like I remember I gave the example on the server once before, but like there are genuinely people out there that are so enmeshed in the hindrance of anger that even the littlest tiny thing will completely set them off in the most like crazy way, where they're literally like throwing things and hitting people and everything. Like to then just say to that person, "Oh, just establish yourself in the five precepts," like that's already an impossibility for them. There needs to be something more gradual, and like you say, there needs to be something that's like not the full level of wholesomeness, but it's less wholesome, less unwholesome. Sorry. So for that person, if they, I don't know, if they're used to like throwing a rock, like a table through the window or something, every time they get angry. Um, if the next step of calm is just for them to, I don't know, like you know punch a punching bag or something. Like it's um slightly less wild for them. That's enough to then just calm the mind slightly and just to give them enough space to reflect, actually what I was doing before was harmful for me, harmful for my mind, and it was harmful to other people. Okay, once established themselves in that level of anger or whatever it is, then they can calm themselves even further. I'm not going to give particular examples, but you can apply this to anything, right? Like with sensuality, for example. If you're to give a personal example, I used to listen to a lot of music. It was almost to the point where it was like the first thing I do in my day, like during when I was traveling, when I was working, or whatever. To then ask me to give up music altogether would have been way too much for me. But for me, it was enough to just say, okay, I'll listen to music throughout the day because I'm used to that. But if I just give up music during my morning routine for like half an hour or something, for the mind, that wasn't too bad. Okay, I can do that. I've got space for my mind to some music, but for that half an hour, I would not do that. And like you say, you get that little reward from it because you give up for half an hour. You may go through a little bit of withdrawal, but you actually realize, well, the mind is being impulsive, but if I don't give into it, the mind actually calms down, and it's actually quite pleasant, to be honest, to have a mind that is not being stimulated so much during the morning. Like I can experientially confirm for myself that the mind is clearer. I can think about what I need to do during the day. The mind is less, muddled. The mind is less distracted, and I have the experiential confirmation. And then, yeah, the rest of the day I might listen to music, but at least I have that, and then I can maybe take the next step. And it feels natural then because I've already had the experiential confirmation. It's like, okay, well, why don't I then stop listening to music during my journey to work? And it's these small steps that you have, like you said, you have those little rewards and you have the experiential confirmation of it's actually more pleasurable. And then you keep increasing it and increasing it and increasing it. And I think when you first do it, it feels unsatisfying. It's like, I want to get to the full enlightenment and I want to get to the full abandonment of sensuality. But actually, if you just make those small steps, you know, it's not going to take that long for that to flourish into something larger compared to, if you try to do some sort of full abandonment where you become fully celibate and fully abandon sensuality. Like you said, that's just going to end up having that rubber band effect where you binge and then you realize like a year's passed and all I've done is just go back and forth and go back and forth. I've not made any permanent sort of reductions. Um, so yeah, you need to just think about your own like you said, your worst addictions, the worst way your mind is fettered, the worst ways your mind is distracted and impulsive, and see if you can slowly make sure you can calm it in ways that are manageable. And then over time, it works pretty well, to be honest.
No, I would say so that it is quite important that you mentioned this experiential confirmation. If you never commit to your whatever you try to renounce to the point where there's actually a chance of that feeling better to set in, then no amount of effort that you can invest into this kind of practice will ever bring any results. You quite literally, I would at least say, you need this kind of reward, and you have to feel it, so to speak, on the level of gut feeling. Otherwise, the mind is not willing to commit. It's a bit like taking the log out of the water, as described in the suttas, and leaving it to dry. You can do that, but if you still internally value all those things, if the mind still wants all those things, because it is not, it has nothing better yet, then it will go back to its old domain. That's at least what I would say. So if you do not commit fully enough, if you do not really withdraw from that domain, then it's I don't think you can make any lasting progress unless you also experience the joy of actually giving those things up. So you have to renounce a sufficient amount so that there's actually something that you can feel, so to speak, in terms of lightness and ease. Because if you do too little at once, it might be okay for you to do it, but you never actually experience any kind of reward. And it's not that easy to find that middle ground. So it's quite easy to do too much or to do too little, and striking the right balance in the middle is quite challenging, I would say.
Yeah, and it also depends on so much things like your environment and your friendships and things like that. Because if you're trying to do a lot when you have a really bad environment, it's going to make it more difficult. You're going to feel that sort of tension even more between the way you're trying to be and the way that, social customs or other people or just all these pressures around you are trying to make you be. Whereas if you have like friends that are also into spirituality and abandoning sensuality and you have a calm environment, then it is easier to um, push the boat a bit more and then try to give up more. And the mind is going to be easily more calmer because instead of being in a very, very busy household, like in nature or something, and abandoning um, course activities like restlessly surfing the internet becomes much easier. Um, so it depends a lot on these sort of background things that are going on as well. But yeah, I fully agree with you that you need that at least some level of internal confirmation of the pleasurableness of renunciation. Because otherwise, you just get to the point where you're only doing these things, you're only renouncing things because someone else has told you. And then it's almost like this idea like, oh, someone else has told me if I renounce these things, then I will get some pleasure. And you just give up out of a sense of duty. And then you're just hoping some pleasure rises. But that pleasure is not going to rise unless you actually give up at the level of your mind um, craving in regards to the actual feeling that's present. Um, and then you confirm for yourself, like, my mind is becoming calmer and that is more pleasurable.
Mm.
And like you said, that doesn't have to be like the full level of the entirety of the hindrances. It just needs to be a bit better than where you are now. So like I was saying before, like just that little bit better where in the morning my mind's a bit calmer. That's a bit pleasurable. And I can see that. But if I try to say to myself, oh, I'm going to give up all of music straight away, my mind just throughout the entire day will be like, well, actually, I like music. I don't know why I'm giving it up, except that, the Buddha's told me or whatever. And so the mind is going to be full of tension, full of dissatisfaction. It's going to be doubting about why am I giving all this stuff up? It's going to be, I'm looking around myself and thinking about all these other people that are enjoying sensuality. And yeah, I'm going to get absolutely no calm from it. Whereas
Mm.
the first way I talked about, you do get that confirmation. And then it becomes natural. It's like, well, why don't I just give up music even more?
Mm.
And then you keep giving up and you keep giving up. And then it's like, well, I just don't listen to music anymore. And it's not because someone else told me, it's because I know for myself the mind is calmer. The mind that doesn't need to listen to music is actually much more pleasurable. Natural sounds sound much better, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Um, and this process, I guess, just to be aware about it, can take years. Probably will take years, but like we keep saying, it's you don't have to worry about that because each step um, of each week, each month, or whatever is going to have its own level of reward to it. Um, so it's not a bad thing, really.
I also think it's another good way to think of the entire process is to change your view on sensuality gradually, so that you try to really drill the message into the mind that at least parts of sensuality are not as good and as pleasant and calming and peaceful as you have initially thought. Intellectually, you might know that. Intellectually, you might have get a good understanding that you just follow your sensual impulses because you are pressured in the first place by the want to eat chocolate or something like that. But on the level of your views, on the level of your heart, you still want the chocolate. You still want to go for it. And that has to change. And you kind of have to make the mind get the message. You kind of have to point it toward that realization over and over and over until you cannot really forget that anymore. You will not change your entire view on sensuality like that, at least not initially, but even changing it partially is quite beneficial because then, at least this very much relates to this experiential confirmation, you at least have partially changed the way your heart, your mind relates to sensuality. And then it's actually much easier to abstain from eating that chocolate or whatever uh, poison we have chosen. I think it's, well, for some people at least, it's quite good to think of the entire process in terms of views, but maybe that's just me. After all, I would say at least that sensuality is a view, in in some respect at least. You assume sensuality to be pleasant, and you do so on the level of the heart, where the heart or the mind or the chitta is just convinced that sensuality is something good, and it might express itself through eating chocolate or taking drugs or doing this or that. And when that changes and it's no longer regarded as something so pleasant, then the view changes, and you no longer whatever. Even when you are in front of some delicious cake, you will no longer want to eat it in the same way as before. If you have truly seen through that pleasantness, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting how you make this distinction between um, what the chitta or what the mind or what the heart experiences, and then what your intellectual mind is saying, because those are often two very different things. Like your intellectual mind might have read the sutras and said that yeah, sensuality is harmful, and I've gone through all of the reasons. I've repeated them to myself. I've thought about it in many different ways, talked to people about it. But if you actually look deep down inside of you, do I still value sensuality? Yeah. And actually, like deep down, even though I have all these intellectual reasons, like I don't really see a problem with it. Like, when I started to give up music, like music, it's not that deep, is it? It's not like I'm killing someone if I listen to music. Doesn't come off to me like it says in the sutras about it being like charcoal pit or something. Um, so there was no point really in trying to overlay my intellectual mind on top of it and just be like, no, 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 it's harmful, because I'm therefore trying to actually reject or overpower what the chitta is telling me. And that's almost representative itself of that self-view, of that sense of control, because you're basically saying my intellectual mind, which is me, if I just overlay what I think on top of what the chitta thinks, I can control it and I can dominate it and I can say no, sensuality is harmful, even though the chitta is telling me no, sensuality is good. And then my whole practice is me basically using my willpower, using my sense of self to try and, overpower the chitta. But it doesn't work because the whole point of why you're engaging with sensuality is that the chitta is more powerful than you. It overpowers you. Um, So then you realize you need to have much more subtle ways of calming the chitta down. And that's why we have to introduce the graduality to it. Because if you're trying to overpower it, you're going to be using that sense of control. Chitta is going to overpower you. But if you use this more sort of gradual means where you're like, okay, chitta, maybe go this way, try this out a little bit. Maybe try this little dose of renunciation, see how this feels like. And the chitta's like, oh, actually, that's actually pretty good, this renunciation stuff. Let me actually go more towards that. And you almost have to play with it in this sense, play out its own game, so to speak. Um, and then, like that whole practice is why you realize then if you practice sila truly and you practice sense restraint truly, and you actually understand how sense restraint can occur on a long-term level, naturally the sense of self does start to diminish because the whole condition of successful sila, of successful sense restraint, is that you stop trying to overpower your mind from this point of view of a sense of self, and you start to play it at its own means. And that's why, when hillside hermitage talk about understanding the science of the mind and so on, this kind of what they mean. Like you stop trying to overpower the chitta, play its own game, and that comes through fundamentally very gradual, um, very gradual training.
Mhm. I think the word training is also quite suitable, given all the animal similes that the Buddha gave when it comes to the taming of the chitta. When you read the suttas, the chitta is usually compared to quite a strong animal. It's usually not, I don't know, a squirrel. It's usually an elephant, a wild horse, some feral dog or something along those lines. And now you are quite small and quite weak in comparison to that wild elephant. It could crush you at any given moment, but you still have to tame it in some way or another. But you cannot do it by the means of sheer strength. This will not work. You have to find a more gradual and more intelligent approach where you can actually make the animal prefer the way of living that you have intellectually at least already accepted as better. So you have to decondition, for example, the old forest feral habits of the elephant. And it will not just behave as you wish. You have to be smart about it. You have to understand how the animal works, what the animal wants, and you have to sometimes whip it with a stick or something like that, so that it actually stays within its domain. And only if you are really smart about it, and if you have ever tried to tame any kind of animal, then you will notice that it will take a lot of patience. It will not do as you please or as you wish. It will take a very long time. And if you make some mistakes along the line, then it will sometimes even revert back to its own ways and will be even more cautious around you. So you have to really be very careful and very intelligent about the entire approach, especially around an elephant that could kill you. Or at least present you with deadly suffering. Let's put it like that. I guess the animal similes were much more relatable at the time of the Buddha when people were used to being around animals all the time, so that you could actually see and know, okay, this is quite a difficult thing to do. This animal will clearly not do as I wish. Maybe you can compare it to a puppy nowadays that you want to train. Even a puppy, even if it's not very feral, will not do as you please. And it's quite difficult to train its behavior. It will sometimes take a year, and the dog will still not behave. And it's the same with our mind. It's quite unruly.
I think there is a reason though why, like in the sutras, it's always described in these such universal terms in terms of abandoning the whole of sensuality. I think the danger is, since most people, especially lay followers, are knee deep in sensuality, if we talk too much about this gradual approach, it ends up meaning that Buddhism just becomes like self-improvement, basically. It's not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of the early parts of the practice are kind of like that. But it just means then, like most people are just talking about abandoning particular vices, like I mentioned music before, or abandoning like smoking or something, or abandoning, distraction on the internet or something. But it is important to note as well that like the thing that you're going towards is ultimately abandonment of sensuality at the sort of most general level, abandonment of any sort of sensual pleasure or distraction that your mind is going towards. Just to have that at the back of your mind, because if you don't, then like you're saying, this process can take years, and then you kind of forget the whole point of what you're doing. So like we're saying, you get a lot of little rewards along the way.
Mhm.
So a lot of people might, like in the sutras where it talks about, stopping at an inferior attainment. A lot of people get into Buddhism because, I feel like I'm suffering, I'm anxious, whatever, and then they practice a bit of virtue, they practice a bit of sense restraint, and actually that in itself already transforms their life completely. Um, like when I was talking about music before, I keep going back to the example because I used to listen to so much. I started to notice that actually once I stopped listening to music, just the most just natural sounds around me started to sound amazing because the mind didn't need as much stimulation as before to feel the same amount of happiness. Less stimulation was needed to feel the same amount of happiness. And actually, if I didn't know about Buddhism, I would have probably just stopped there and I'd be like, okay, this is my new sort of normal. And I wouldn't actually go further because that in itself was insanely pleasant. But because I had faith, because the Buddha only said, try and abandon even more. Um, Not only things like music, but also, things that humanity in general finds completely normal and attuned towards, such as excessive company or excessive idle talk, which seems way too ascetic and strange. If you go towards that, and then even towards the abandonment of sensuality in general, where you're just like literally your normal abiding is just sitting in calm and non-distracted mode, mindful, not dependent on all those distractions, that is going to be the absolute supreme bliss. Because if you think about it, if just that little bit of renunciation was already that pleasurable, and I do think if you practice it in a way where you're practicing gradually and you're practicing trying to access and just be mindful of the pleasure of the renunciation, you have to realize how pleasurable that full release is going to be. And that's what you kind of have to have in your mind as the goal, but without trying to skip ahead, because that's what usually happens, right? Because you have the idea of the full goal, and then you're like, okay, I want to get there, I want to get there, I want to get there. It's going to take a long time, but that is the goal. So don't stop in failing attainment through practicing gradually either, because you're going to miss the fruits of it. At the same time, I do think as well, like if you practice in a gradual manner, there is like this onwardness that starts to manifest, where just a little bit of renunciation will almost prod you and be like, okay, maybe I'll go a bit further because like we were saying before, the experiential confirmation gives you further faith and further confidence to go even more further ahead. Um, yeah.
Would you say that it's a good thing to actively look from time to time for the pleasures of renunciation, so to speak, and to actively nudge the mind towards it? Is it something that you can miss?
Mm. It's a good question, actually. I think you need to look for it in the sense that most people, when they think of renunciation, they only think about it in terms of a bodily and verbal renunciation. So, for example, when I talked about music before, it can be easy to assume that the sensuality is in the actual listening of the music. But you can actually like abandon the physical and verbal listening, but be mentally full of that craving towards music. Um, so the looking for the pleasure kind of happens where you give up physically and verbally listening to music, and then you actually look at the mind and have a look actually what's going on there. There is all this pressure there. There is all these impulses there. Okay, well, what is the actual gratification that I'm getting out of that? If I go listen to this music now, what is the gratification of that? And because you've restrained yourself to realize the gratification of it is not me listening to this amazing song, it's mainly going to be avoiding this pain of the pressure. And then you realize, on the other hand, if I don't go in the direction of gratifying that pressure, the mind's going to calm down in regards to it. And then I can actually access that pleasure now because I looked for it on a mental level. Um, on the other hand, it can be for some people that especially if you're coming from a background in um, like meditation techniques where the pleasure is much more ecstatic and much more palpable, If you assume that the pleasure of renunciation is going to be like this ecstatic, orgasmic pleasure, then that's going to end up being your craving fundamentally. Because what's going to happen is you're going to be renounced. It's going to be some level of tranquility or something, but because of your expectations and assumptions on what pleasure is, you're going to be hoping for something more palpable. And for that person that's actually trying to look for that pleasure, it's going to be obscuring the pleasure that's actually there on account of renunciation and already being tranquil, but not tranquil in a way where everything is calm all the time. But it's more like that the mind just has less of a need um, to stimulate itself, even when there's like uncomfortableness present, because the mind and the senses are uncomfortable.
Mm.
But when you give up that tendency towards sensuality on the course level, you'll be able to handle that much better. So the calm is not this ecstatic pleasure. It's more like this tranquility with whatever appears.
Mm. Yeah,
People
healthiness.
confuse that with being, yes, it's literally just healthiness. That's kind of a good way to put it because you don't, um, when the body is healthy, it's not like it's some ecstatic pleasure. It's just this feeling of steadiness and fullness almost. And it's the same thing for the mind as well. Like it's not this ecstatic pleasure. It's just this steadiness
Yeah.
amidst the up and down. I
Mm.
think that could be a whole video in itself about what the pleasure of renunciation is. But
Yes.
I think some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think we can do one of those too. But anyway, I think we are quite rapidly approaching the end of the recording window. I think we only have like 2 minutes left or something. I always cannot read those numbers. But it might be a good time to stop this recording at this point. I hope we have given you some good cues on how to actually let go of sensuality overall and how important it is that you experience some rewards along the way, but also not lose sight of the overarching goal of abandoning the entirety of sensuality. But yeah. If you have any follow-up questions, I would suggest that you put them down in the comments below or join the Discord server and ask us. We have weekly and sometimes daily discussions on the Dhamma. Yeah, but apart from that, I would say I wish you all a pleasant day and until next time. Bye.